friends, and welcome back to my channel. Today we are going over my favorite tarot decks of 2021. These are the tarot decks that I just loved using and could not put away this year. I have already done a video all about my favorite Oracle decks of 2021, so if you haven't seen that, I will leave a link to that in the cards and in the description box below for you. But without further ado, let's just get stuck straight into my favorite tarot decks of 2021. First, I want to talk about the Spacious Tarot. I love this deck. It's honestly just so funny to me how this went from being a deck that I sort of didn't think I would like and almost resisted when it first came out to being like a deck that I is in my top 5 all-time favorite decks. Like, I'm obsessed with it. I love it. I never want to get rid of it. It's perfect. It's amazing. All of the things. I love it. I do have the first edition, which I think does look and feel a little bit different from the editions that you can get now, but essentially it's the same deck, same artwork, and it's the artwork that does it for me. I have done a full review on this deck, and in that review I spoke about how I think the best word to describe this deck is intimate. This deck feels like, and each card feels like a zoomed in moment, almost like a candid shot of a moment with a character, with a person. In some ways it feels like a moment that we're like privy to, maybe that we're not supposed to be privy to. I don't know, there's just something very sensitive and personal and intimate about this deck, and that's one of the things that feels really special to me about it. I think it's a combination of the often very close in shots of like hands, of bodies, of faces, combined with the fact that a lot, not all, but a lot of the characters in the deck are naked. All of that combined with the art style itself just makes this deck feel really intimate and personal and sensual as well. For me, it's a deck that captures feeling and emotion perfectly. Like, rather than creating a really elaborate scene that depicts the goings on in a card, or rather than like really focusing on heavy symbolism that creates the message of the card, for me, the Spacious Tarot captures the feeling of a card. And that is a very subjective thing, but for me, this deck just taps into perfectly how I feel about the cards. And when I do readings with this deck, it's a very emotional response to the cards. I feel the message before I know it, if that makes sense. And this is just one of those decks that I feel like I can just go to. I can whip out the cards, I can do a reading, things will just flow, things will make sense, but they'll still feel emotionally resonant. And I find that a lot of the times when I do readings with this deck, it feels very validating and affirming. It feels supportive. It feels like it witnesses my own experiences and pains and longings, but also encourages me to move through that pain or to move through those feelings. It's not about denying experience or emotion, it's about moving through, moving with. And I love the way that this deck encourages me to do that. It's honestly just one of the most moving, beautiful, easy reading experiences I've ever had with a tarot deck. So I feel like this is almost always going to be a favorite for me. At least I can't envision a time where it won't be, and it certainly was for 2021. Next up is the Spacious Tarot. Now, this is a deck that I've done a full flip through of, first impressions of, as well as a full video for my Tarot and Practice series, which, if you don't know, is a series where I spend about a month with a deck and I vlog the experience of doing different readings, sharing my interpretations, and give like a mini review of the experience at the end. So it's quite an in-depth personal experience with a deck that I share with you in that series, and I think going through that experience with this deck, it was a really special one. This is already a deck that I love and is very special to me, but doing the Tarot and Practice just sort of reminded me of how incredible this deck is. Annie's artwork is just gorgeous. It's so beautiful. It's almost soothing. And I love how each card, they're fairly simple. The depictions in these cards are fairly simple, but they feel so intentional and specific. In some ways, this deck is almost the opposite of the Spacious Tarot, where the Spacious Tarot really feels like it zooms in on small moments, everyday moments that matter to individual people and characters in the cards. Instead, the Spacious Tarot feels like it removes those moments, it zooms out. And in doing so, it allows space for us as individuals to fit ourselves and our own interpretations, our own experiences into these cards. Rather than capturing a small moment that we can identify with in this Spacious Tarot, the Spacious Tarot invites us as the reader into the card. Along with that, the little white book, the guidebook that Carrie Mallon has written, I think is wonderful. I think it's one of my favorite little white books that I've ever had with a tarot deck. There's not a huge amount of information that Carrie had space to give us for each card, and yet it feels so expansive, each and every message. As with the tarot deck, the guidebook feels so intentional and and so well thought through. Nothing about this deck, the artwork, the guidebook, anything, feels accidental. Working with this deck for me almost just feels like an invitation to expand awareness, to just contemplate and consider our own position, our own thoughts, our own feelings. It's like it's an invitation to not only expand our understanding of ourselves and our own experiences, but also to expand our understanding and our appreciation of what each tarot card can be. It just feels like such a holistic, balanced, well thought out deck, and that definitely comes through in my readings. My readings feel quite steady, but sure and calm and very clear. They allow space for me and my lived experience, but they also encourage me to go further, to go beyond, to consider more, to be more. It's just another one of those decks that feels so easy to read with, and yet there feels like there's so much there. It's easy to be drawn into the cards. It's easy to want to dive in and to participate in a conversation with them. And I think especially because I had a bit of a break from tarot, sort of diving into a deck like this, it felt like a breath of fresh air to me and my tarot practice. It was wonderful. Another deck that I've done a tarot in practice with, and that sort of blew me away to be honest, was the Children of Litha. Now this deck, this particular edition of this deck was sent to me very kindly by Tom Benjamin. I had purchased myself the black edition, which is the edition that is currently available from what I understand, but I hated that cardstock. I found it impossible to shuffle and work with, but I was really drawn to the artwork. So Tom Benjamin kindly offered to send me his deck if I paid for postage, which I was happy to do. And this is the gold edition, which I think was the first edition, or it was an earlier edition anyway, which is a bit harder to get now, but does have matte cardstock, so is beautiful to shuffle. Now this is a very fae, elemental, animal-based deck. It's not solely animal-based. There are humanoid figures throughout the deck, but they primarily exist in the major arcana and the court cards. The minor cards, the 1 to 10 or the 2 to 10, are animals. And as we know, I don't always love animal tarot decks. So this one was a little bit of a gamble for me. Like I said, it's not only an animal deck, but it is animal heavy. However, there's something about the choices that are made, the way that the animals are represented, that just makes sense to me. On top of that, I just really love the major arcana and the court cards, and the artwork is just stunning. This deck is just so far beyond beautiful. I don't have words for it. It feels quite raw and almost brutal at times, but I think that really works with the elemental fae sort of approach or perspective of this deck. The little white book is pretty great too. I really like the messages. For me, any cards that maybe didn't make 100% sense at first, like I clicked once I read the message and I understood the intention. I also really like the little poems or incantations that go along with each card. I think that's a great touch. And I think if you've watched the Tarot in Practice episode, you can see that I pulled these cards out and like my readings, my messages just flowed. Like they were intuitive, they made sense. It felt like that conversation, that free flow happened between me and this deck, which I wasn't 100% expecting, but I loved the experience of working with this deck. I got some very, very strong messages, not all messages that I necessarily maybe wanted to hear or wanted to share online, but there were messages that I damn well needed to hear. This is one of those decks that I feel like you sort of have to be careful about what you ask it, because it's going to tell you the truth. For me, it read very blunt and straightforward in a way that almost felt brutal sometimes. But at the same time, it had this sense of humor. Like I felt like sometimes the deck was kind of laughing at or with me, maybe a bit of both. And so that humor, that levity, that playfulness did sort of take away that, like the edge of that bite a little bit for me. I was surprised by how quickly I connected with this deck and how easily the readings came to me. But the experience was just so good that I loved every moment, and I know that this is a deck I'm going to return to again and again. So unlike the Sakurai Beto and the Spacious Tarot, this is a little bit of a newer favorite, but it quickly has become a favorite. I loved working with it this year. And thank you again to Tom Benjamin for giving me that opportunity. I think I would have given up on the black edition because I just hated the shuffling experience so much. So having a deck that not only do I love the artwork, I connect with the artwork, but I like the cardstock too, it made all the difference. Next up is a deck that I have sort of mentioned quite a bit on my channel since I got it, but I haven't done like a full video about, and that is the Chrysalis Tarot. This deck is another one that has very much surprised me, but I'm really enjoying. This is a bit of an older deck. It is a mass market deck. It's a deck that I've known about for a long time. I just sort of never got around to buying it. I think when I first became aware of it, I was a little bit concerned that it was a bit too unique, a bit too advanced for me. It does deviate from the Rider-Waite-Smith system quite a lot, and I just don't think I was ready for that back when I first discovered this deck. But it sort of re-entered my sphere of consciousness a few times, and then Saturnarium did a wonderful video featuring featuring this deck, and my interest was piqued. We had it at the TS where I was working at the time. I get a nice staff discount, so I figured why not pick it up and give it a go. And honestly, it was one of those experiences that I was kind of blown away by. I did go through and read the little white book that comes with the deck. I don't have the larger guidebook, and I just went through and sort of enjoyed my time with the cards, and it became apparent to me that although this is based on the Rider-Waite-Smith system or the tarot system, it does deviate a lot, and in some ways you just sort of have to allow the deck to be what it is rather than trying to force it into the tarot system. Where this deck does deviate, it's very intentional and specific about what it was trying to achieve, so it never feels like it just sort of didn't know what it was doing. Decks that deviate from the tarot system just for the sake of it, I do sometimes struggle with. This deck, the intentionality was there, so I was willing to sort of go along with it. I felt like I was in safe hands. And my God, the readings with this deck, it was so on point and like predictive sort of readings that I didn't even know I was predicting stuff until after the fact, you know? Like it's that sort of reading that was just so on point. It felt meaningful and significant at the moment of the reading, but it became even more so and more significant as like my reality unfolded. For example, it predicted me getting a job at a children's bookshop before I even like knew that that was a thing that was like at all a possibility for me. I never even applied for that job specifically, and this deck predicted it long before it happened, and I just like looking back, my mind was blown. On top of that, it's also just been quite helpful. Like it's given me some very clear direction and advice as well, which I found like I've really appreciated. So I haven't worked with this deck a huge amount, but every single reading that I've done with it has just been incredible, like next level incredible. I can only imagine the more time I spend with this deck, the more familiar I become with it, the more of a connection I develop with it, the better these readings are going to be. So I'm already in awe, and I can't wait to see where I go with this deck. Next up is a deck that I haven't really done readings with, but I could not include in my favorite tarot decks of the year. And that is because it just brought me so much damn joy. And that is the Bangtan Tarot by Sarah, Julie, and Heather. They created this deck, which you cannot purchase. I'm so sorry, Army, but you can't. They created this deck sort of for themselves, and they sent me a copy as a gift. And this is exactly what it sounds like. It's a deck about BTS. Honestly, it's just one of those things that just makes me so happy. It's so thoughtfully done. Like it sounds like it's a gimmick, but it's not. The intention and the thought that went into this from the three of them who created this deck is just beyond, I can't. It's both so clever and so specific, and also just really lighthearted and fun. It arrived at a time when I was not feeling super great. I was sort of struggling a little bit. And so to receive such a generous, kind present from some people that I know online, it really touched me. It really meant a lot to me. And then on top of that, like how fabulous this deck is. Every single time I pull it out, and I do pull it out to have a good look at it every now and then, I cannot help but smile. And it makes my day every time. And Drunk Hobie having an existential crisis in the Four of Cups will never not be my favorite tarot card. So this might not technically classify as one of the decks that I spent the most time working with, but it absolutely is the deck that brought me the most joy in 2021. And I personally feel like that more than qualifies it to end up on the list of my favorite tarot decks of the year. Next up is another deck that I spent quite a bit of time with, including a Tarot in Practice episode, and that is the Star Spinner Tarot. I love this deck. I think I got this deck last year or the year before, whenever it was first released, and I said then that I felt like this deck was making me fall back in love with tarot, and I feel like this deck kind of helped me do that again this year. I personally feel like this is such an underrated deck. It's fabulous. It's mass market, but the production quality is wonderful, and the artwork and the intention and the thought that has gone into this deck, both into the cards themselves and into the guidebook, are phenomenal. It's such a unique, beautiful, evocative, colorful art style that I just adore. It incorporates lots of stories from fairy tales and folklore, which I think is really clever. I don't know or understand all of it, but I feel like there's just lots of different layers to this deck. It fits well enough with the Rider-Waite-Smith that you can just sort of read it for what it is, and if you have an understanding of the tarot system, but there's a lot more to it if you want to dive into that, or if you know more about some of the stories that are included. Of course, famously, this deck also includes 4 different lovers cards that you can choose from, or you can incorporate all 4 if you want lots of love in your deck. And this is just another one that I loved reading with. It maybe doesn't come as easily to me as something like the Sakurai Beta or the Spacious Tarot, but it comes easily enough that I feel like it's accessible to me. And I just really enjoyed spending time with this deck. The messages felt meaningful, insightful, but they still sort of lured me in and invited me in to learn more about this deck and to understand more the intentions and the stories behind the artwork. I love how even though there is so much color, it's so vibrant, it all still feels so cohesive. And I love how each of the suits sort of has like a color theme, so they really stand out in a spread. It sort of feels like an updated modern take on the fairy tale style of tarot deck, and I think it's fabulous. I love it. Next up is a deck I've probably spent not quite as much time with, but has still just sort of really taken me by surprise, and that is the Orients Tarot. I have the little mini version. I have ordered the larger one. It hasn't arrived yet though, but that's how much I loved it. I wanted the big version as well. This deck is by Ambi-sun, who lives in Melbourne, I think. And this deck is an entirely animal-based deck, which I know I've said multiple times in this video alone, let alone on my channel over the years, that animal decks are just not my thing. So what gives? Well, there's just something so damn special about this deck. I think in part it's like the galactic cosmic feeling of each card. Like it doesn't just feel like an animal in its setting. It doesn't feel like a realistic animal. It almost feels like the origin of the animal, or like the cosmic constellation version of the animal. It's beautifully done. The artwork's stunning. And on top of that, I love how even though there are lots of animals from all over the world, there are a handful of Australian animals as well. So there's plenty of animals that I don't know a whole lot about, but there's enough there to make me feel like this deck means something to me, that this deck is connected to me and my lived experience as well. I know some people have encouraged me to dive into decks that feature only animals that are from, mostly the Northern Hemisphere, and to just, learn more about those animals. And that is one option for people who love animal decks. But the thing is, I have lots of reasons for not loving animal decks. And I think on top of that, feeling like it represents a part of the world that just is not my part of the world. And I've already got a lot of stuff going on. So to spend a lot of time and effort and energy into learning about 78 animals that I will never know, never see, never have anything to do, feels like an awful lot of work to do for a tarot deck, So having just a handful of animals that I look at and I know the call of, I know the sound of, I know the behavior of, it feels like a gateway into this deck for me. On top of that, I just love Australian animals. So why wouldn't I want them in my tarot decks if I'm gonna have an animal tarot deck, On top of that, the guidebook for this deck is just incredible. It's beautifully done, beautifully produced, beautifully laid out with so much incredible artwork throughout. It's an experience just flipping through that thing. But the way that the cards are spoken about and the meanings are explored and the connection to the animal is explored in that guidebook is fabulous. There are a handful of cards in this deck that I don't quite click with, that I don't get immediately, but they are quite few in number. So even when those cards do come up, they don't feel like this frustrating hurdle for me accessing the meanings of the cards. Instead, they feel like exciting challenges and opportunities for me to consider. Another reason this deck has made it into my favorites list this year is because Blair has also kind of fallen in love with it. He is about as non-woo as a person can get, but there's something about this deck that he loves as well. And there has been times when I've been sort of playing with this deck or looking through the deck and he'll come up and ask if he can draw a card. We have done a couple of times where we've drawn a couple of cards for him and maybe I've read him the message from the guidebook and asked him what he thinks, or just asked him to, tell me what he sees in the picture and what he thinks it might mean for him. And it's actually provoked some really important and sensitive conversations between the two of us. So this deck has also just allowed me to have some really amazing moments with Blair, which has been incredible. And then the deck that I'm currently working with and so happy to be working with again is the Next World Tarot. I love this deck. I knew December was going to be a bit of a rough month for me, so I felt like I needed to be working with a deck this month that saw me, that validated me, that affirmed me, that celebrated me. And no deck has ever done that more than the Next World Tarot. I think this is just one of the best decks that we have on the market. I love it. I think it's so inclusive, celebratory, representative. It honors our individual experiences. It celebrates our differences as well as what brings us together. It validates our difficult experiences, our challenges, both systemic and personal, and it also affirms us as human beings. For me, this deck is such a gift. Whenever I work with it, I just feel emotional. And the readings that I've been doing with it this month have just felt like a wash of love and acceptance and reality and celebration, but also just like grief. I don't know, like it's a mix. It's a beautiful, beautiful mix that honors the realities of our lived experiences. And I just don't think I could love a deck more than I love the Next World Tarot. I just feel so grateful to have it in my life. And I feel like this deck shows up for me in ways that almost no other deck ever has or ever could. Because I see me in that deck. I see my community. I see the people around me. I see the people that I love in that deck in a way that I don't think I've seen in very many other tarot decks. And for me, that is not only important in like a theoretical kind of way, it's important on like a soul level. And that is why that deck moves me so much. And I feel so connected to it, and it's so special to me. And I don't think I could have picked a better deck to support me through quite a challenging month. It's incredible, and I'm just so grateful to have it and to have it helping me through this difficult period. So those are my favorite tarot decks of 2021. A few new decks, quite a few old favorites, and just all of these decks have been so special to me and have brought me joy and comfort in different ways. I would love to hear in the comments below what your favorite tarot decks have been in 2021, and if you missed it, I have also done a video about my favorite oracle decks of the year, which I will leave in the description box below for you. Of course, a big thank you to my patrons over on Patreon for all of your support, and especially big thank you goes to Livia, Lynette Brown, Laurie, and Ian Yitzhak for their very generous support of me and my channel. And a big thank you to you for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I will talk to you again soon. So much love. Bye.